Fáilte chuirde go dtí an webinar seo tá a bhreachtá le going leis an cuiste sa Clifden Arts Festival agus Institute the Mór the Ulscoil na Héireann in Galway. You're very welcome to join us this morning with our panel discussion in association with the Clifden Arts Festival in Galway and also the Moore Institute at NUI Galway today. We've been invited to organise this panel to honour and celebrate the lives and legacies of Tim and Mairéad Robinson, who passed away earlier this year. When we received the invitation from Lally and Brendan Flynn, we were delighted to contribute to what has been a long-standing point in the calendar in Ireland, the Clifden Arts Festival that comes around every September and is always much looked forward to with bated breath by those of us working in the arts and the cultural sectors as well. They in particular wanted to convene something more of an event to commemorate but also to celebrate their lives. So the idea of friendships and fieldwork came up as a theme that we wanted to explore today with our guest panelists, who I'll introduce to you shortly today as well. We're also aware that there will be many events that will be organised towards the ends of this year and going forward, marking Tim and Mairéad's work, their lives and their legacies to those of us in Ireland. But also with regard to other academic events and other events throughout the arts and the cultural sphere, where they had a huge recognition for their work, but also in terms of the impact they had for a whole generation of new scholars, artists, academics and activists in different ways. So in many ways, this is only one of a whole series of different kinds of events that will be happening across Ireland and internationally, I'm sure, over the next 12 months in particular. But this morning we're delighted to have a personal tribute with a series of reflections from friends, old and new, who have known Tim and Mairéad over the years, and we're delighted to have them with us, offering some thoughts and reflections on those this morning. And before we get into that, I'd like just to offer a few words of thanks, in particular to the Moore Institute and Professor Dan Carey and Mr. David Kelly, who have been running a webinar series since lockdown in March and April this year, and has been a beacon of light and hope to many of us, keeping us all very much connected while we are physically separated in these difficult times. And indeed, lockdown has shown two or three things that I think we'll be touching on today as well. First of all, the primacy and the absolute importance of the arts, not just in Irish society, but to society in general. And that the Clifden Arts Festival, again, even though it's operating in a slightly different format this year due to the COVID-19 crisis, it again reminds us how vital the arts are to help us understand who we are as a people, who we could be as a community, and also helping us to reimagine better futures for all of us on the island of Ireland and globally as well too. I'd also like to thank our colleagues at the university at NUI Galway, who over the years since 1972 became very good friends with Tim and Mairéad when they arrived on the Ilan Oran, and in particular to people from departments across from archaeology to zoology, and many of those are hopefully listening into this morning, but we would like to also offer a thanks and a note of acknowledgement for their contribution to the friendships down over the years. I finally would also like to thank Anna Bowman in London. She has offered a beautiful photograph for us, which shows a kind of a joyful engagement of Tim and Mairéad and their arrival in Arran in 1973, and also to acknowledge the Johanny Archive and johanny.org for the closing credits and for the song Aron Weenisha that Brendan Flynn had recommended that we use, as well, as it was a great Seamus favourite of Tim and Mairéad as well. Finally then, I would like to thank you, our audience. We've had this idea of friendship and fieldwork. We could have had many people contributing to this discussion today, but we had just a limited time and a limited remit, but we hope that this will be the beginning of other kinds of conversations. And as we know, Tim and Mairéad were a fan of a conversation and a co-raw and an ogle of Bertha in many different ways. So when we were convening this, one session contributor said to me, could we zoom into heaven and get Tim and Mairéad maybe to zoom in with us? Unfortunately, we obviously won't be able to do that, but we hope that this conversation will engender new ones into the future, whilst honouring the two very precious friendships that we're here today to give tribute to. So I'm delighted to introduce Dr Fidelma Mullane. Fidelma Mullane is a cultural geographer and curator, specialising in the study of vernacular culture, and a former postdoctoral scholar in Irish Studies and at the Moore Institute at NUI Galway. Advising, teaching and publishing as a specialist and advocate, she concentrates on the topic of historic vernacular building traditions and on the promotion of culturally appropriate contemporary building practices. And indeed, one of her most recent projects was to oversee the renovation of Pearse's Cottage for the 2016 commemoration in Ireland. She recently curated the Ireland in Focus Photographing the 1950s exhibition, an exhibition of selected photographs of Ireland as captured by the French photographer Henri Cartier-Bresson, Dorothea Lange and Robert Queswell, which is located at the National Museum of Ireland in Collins Barracks. As President Michael D. Higgins remarked at the opening of Fidelma's exhibition in November last year, tá na halíonna crochíocha de saoirse iontu dúin, bechóir go naithníotar go bunagar na sochaí iad na halíonna comá leis na droichead na bóithre agus le hanbhaunda. Art is a creative act and is also emancipatory. It must be seen as a necessary part of the infrastructure of our society, along with bridges, roads and broadband. And indeed, since that time in November 2019, our whole world has changed, but the one thing that has stayed the same in many ways is that we understand even more now how the arts are absolutely vital for our lives and for our imaginative worlds. So without further ado, I'd like to pass it over to Fidelma to welcome her to the session today and for her to offer her thoughts and reminiscences on Tim and Mairéad Robinson.
Thank you very much, Nessa, and good morning to everybody. Let's start. I start really on how I got to know Tim and Mairéad. Can't remember when I got to know them at all. For some reason, it's a blank. I always seem to have known them, but I don't remember the first time I went to their house. But I got to know them over the years by visiting their house, mostly impromptu if I was going somewhere else or there was something on, and they would always be an open house and an invitation. I also, like many of you here on the panel today, brought students to Tim's workshop, which was an absolute joy. And the students still remember, I've met them recently, some of them, how wonderful, what an extraordinary privilege it was to be in Tim's and Mairéad's company. And the length of time and the amount of energy Tim and Mairéad put into these visits by students was really wonderful and extraordinary. My other reason for going there were maybe what we call social events, and nothing better than the annual regatta to catch up with all the people you hadn't seen for ages from all parts of the world. And the great privilege of the Roundstone regatta, the hooker racing, was the fact that, and curves, was the fact that we were on the pier, directly looking on to the racing and outdoors. It was an absolutely fantastic privilege to go to the Roundstone regatta every year in July. The other social gathering that I liked very much was the Roundstone Conversations. And these conversations, the whole concept of the Roundstone Conversation was set up really, I think, around 2004, 2005. And I was trying to find a rationale for what I was doing there myself and what the whole thing was about. And I found an email recently from Leslie Van Gelder, who was a co-organizer with Tim of the Roundstone Conversations. And in an email to a lot of people, she wanted to explain what the Roundstone Conversation was. Long ago, Tim and I decided that the only people who could invite someone to the conversation were just the two of us, that is Tim and Leslie. So if you've been invited to the conversation, it's because we believe you've something to share, and you needn't wonder about what that is. Just trust us on that and know how delighted we would be to have you there, which I think is absolutely wonderful way to define any project. Very liberating, very free, and open to all. If there's a summary of the characteristics and the personality of Tim and Mairéad, both of them, it was their generosity, hospitality, and openness. How I saw Tim eventually, and all from the day I met him in a way, to me, Tim was an artist. He was an artist from beginning to end. He was a visual artist, mathematician, a writer, a cartographer, and particularly in cartography, he approached it really, in my books, as an art form. He was an artist in everything he did. And I think it's one of the ways we must remember him. My own relationship with him is also another way that I got to know Tim and Mairéad, because he invited me to walk with him. And again, I was wondering what angle I would take, or what about my work or my ideas that would be of interest or of use to Tim. And really it is in his own description of me, which I think is very simple and straightforward, and is really what I was in Inishbofin. He has a chapter on our visit to Inishbofin in The Last Pool of Darkness, where he described me as a travelling companion, which I think was wonderful. And I had another short note from him, a scribble. He was sending something back to me, and he said, "I hope to see you soon for a walkabout," which is, of course, a very profound way of looking at the landscape, looking at all the layers, looking at all mythological, metaphorical, the importance of the landscape. And as I want to emphasize that his emphasis really in all his work as an artist was the understanding, interpretation, and protection of place. Place is probably for me the most interesting angle I can find on his work. He defines place very, very well. And interestingly, I went through a lot of his works and his books in recent times, and I found that I couldn't find where he mentioned heritage or culture too much. He certainly didn't mention heritage that I could find. But what he did mention all the time was place. And it's that emphasis I want to highlight, that wonderful approach he had to understanding place, which is incredibly important. And it is a new paradigm for us. I quote from him in his last book, which I think is very important. And he says really it's the last beat of the drum, or something to that effect. It's Experiments on Reality. And it's his last publication. And I quote from that, "A few swipes of the machete to get me into the thicket." In other words, the usual writing about the thing we all do before we go right into the core of things. "A few swipes of the machete to get me into the thicket." And by the thicket, he meant the nature of place, what makes a place out of a locality, what makes a place so precious that we feel called upon to protect it in the teeth of all rational argumentation. And I'm quoting from Experiments on Reality. And what he proposed, again, I want to emphasize, he didn't mention heritage and all those worthy things that we do, and heritage brings ideas up of the castle and the ring fort, and it's a very kind of monument-led thing. But place is completely different. It's the ownership of the past, the present, and the future is involved in place. And by ownership, I mean understanding, protecting, promoting place. And he drew up 3 paradigms of place that he said could be heard as an elegy for all lost places. But he said instead, let them be heard, I quote, instead, as a call to the defense of such places. And he gives the example, for example, of place names. So we're fascinated by place names, and he said the emphasis really is nominal and does not extend to caring for the places themselves, which is a very important point. Nostalgia stands in for conservation, which I know only too well myself, being involved in conservation as a vernacular house. Every vernacular house in Ireland now has a red door. You know, it's all nostalgia. It's not based, most of it is not based, the conservation of vernacular buildings is not based on research and fact. It's buried in nostalgia. And he emphasized that, not in relation to vernacular, but in general, that the fascination with place names, I quote, does not extend to caring for the places themselves. Nostalgia stands in for conservation, and convenience trumps all. So I think that's a very important laying down of what he understood as important and what really underwrote place. And then, so that people would understand and use examples, which is a very good way of understanding. He chose 3 paradigms, what he calls 3 paradigms, from 3 examples from 3 areas. So he selected the Aran Islands for beauty. It's a wonderful paradigm, and he describes this and why it is a paradigm. He chose the Burn for strangeness, which he bases mostly on a field, and Connemara for antiquity, which he based on stone alignments and solstices and all that. And these 3 paradigms could be the 3 we use, but they show us how we could have 300 more. And perhaps it would be a new way of us researchers and conservationists, and particularly geographers, in understanding place. I feel that Tim, of course, as well as being an artist, was a geographer. I would go so far as to say he's Ireland's most important geographer. And if we were to describe his legacy, I will quote Fintan O'Toole, who said that Tim was the supreme practitioner of geogeography, the writing of places. And I must say, I agree very, very strongly with that. However, I will say that I'm slightly critical of maybe how we are managing Tim's legacy, because Tim's legacy is not really just about what he wrote and his wonderful visual arts, I could call it a magnificent portfolio that was shown in IMA. I think that he hasn't been recognized as the wonderful geographer that he was innovative, creative, he was pushing out the boat, he was doing brand new things. But when I look through bibliographies, and in particular in cartography, I don't see that his work was taken and repeated or interpreted or promoted as the basis for moving into a whole new area of cartography. So we only, in a way, have Tim's work, whereas I feel it would have been better, and I include myself in this as a geographer, had we been more inclusive with Tim, in including him in Irish geography. Now, once in a conversation, I think it might have been in Inishbofin when we were walking, he did suggest that to me in a very veiled way and very discreet, that he would have liked to have been more involved in academic life, not just, and he did praise the help he got from many academics, but that's where it ended, whereas I feel he should have been giving maybe modules to geography students. It's kind of disappointing in a way that he didn't get the opportunity to do work with students directly and to train them as cartographers, especially in the type of cartography that he himself was promoting. However, I must say that we can't, it's not all negative. He was awarded a doctorate or an honorary degree in 1997 by NUI Galway. So at least that is something. And I have to say, and it's very important that it's said, and I think all panelists will agree, that the work of the Moore Institute and the Institute for Irish Studies is extremely important. Both places, both have, through Nessa Cronin and through Dan Carey, have really kept the flag flying, have really put a lot of effort and a lot of time into highlighting Tim's work ensuring his archive is safe, and so on. So I will say that, and that is absolutely extraordinary, because without Nessa and Dan, I'm not sure that the legacy would be safe. I think it should also be mentioned that the Clifden Arts Festival has been a great friend to Tim and Mairéad, and he has done many lectures and appeared at the festival many times, and so that's another way. But I think if we want to move on to something very open, something that is extremely, I think, easy to do, I think we should have a module for first, second and third year geographers on the work of Tim Robinson at different levels, and in particular on place names and cartography. Now, his work on place names, which everybody acknowledges is absolutely extraordinary, is very important. And I refer, for people who are watching online and who may not be living in Ireland, I refer you to, again, Experiments on Reality, where Tim saw, I suppose it was a notice. It's the way you find out things in planning in Ireland. So the notice on the paper is to say they're going to do something, regardless of whether you like it or not. And in the notice, there were 76 townlands, I counted them, listed. And they're all absolutely beautiful. Duishke, Garan North, Coola, Glamescall, French Fort, Carnmore, Lishin Kyle, Barrett's Park, Cahar Briscon, Carondove, Rathmorrissey, Paul Legroke, Ballygaron, Newford, Prospect, Bonmore. That's just a small selection from the 76. Now, he wrote down the 76 place names from the notice in the paper, and he sent a letter to the Irish Times in 2004, suggesting that its readers might relish it. And he ended by saying, I quote from his book, "I don't know these little places, but I'm sure they're as rich in variety and individuality as their names are, even in these anglicised forms. But this is the list of townlands to be torn through by the proposed N6 dual carriageway from Ballinasloe to Galway. Read the list again and weep." And also, what was terribly important, I think, was the recording of place names that would otherwise be lost. And all these place names were lost because the place is lost. So you see, really saying here, there is a connection between place and place name. And when the place name is lost, something is great is lost. And probably most profoundly, the understanding of the place through its place name. So I just want to highlight, in the note he sent me, he had made some homemade note paper, and along the side, it's the coastline of Inish Moor. And he has done all the place names in Irish. And perhaps again, I will recite a few of them. It's like calling up the landscape. And they're written in Irish, and I'm sure many of these would be now long lost with coastal erosion and developments and all such matters that take away our places and ultimately our place names. So I'll recite a few of them because they are so beautiful. On Sunda Coyach, on Isle Rishta, Isle Namornach, Bin Nanisk, on Brunan, on Crow, on Vin Bui, All Thor Nebine Bui, Isle on Ora Here, Isle on Ora Her, on Isle Rishta, Bin on Frontig, Paul Here on Duin, Paul Her on Duin, Lek E Gul, Paul Nagollum. So I'll just read some of those for the music of them. The meaning of them would just take perhaps a week for me to explain each one using Tim's marvellous maps, that mapping the Aran Islands, mapping Connemara, and mapping the Burn. So I think I will leave it at that for the moment, and maybe highlight some other aspects of Tim and Mairéad's work. I should also emphasize that Mairéad was absolutely critical to all the work that Tim and herself did and promoted. And she was absolutely extraordinary driver of ideas and locality and neighbours and friendship and generosity. I will read one little paragraph from this book again. Because it's his last book, I've put emphasis on it. I'll just read how he explained his three paragraphs, or his three paradigms. The secretive beauty of Ireland's spring wells, the strangeness of the ragged little fields of the Burn, the deep antiquity of the stone alignment in Connemara, stand here for the countless precious things for which we will be mourning if in 10 or 20 years' time we find we have sacrificed them to the technology of shortcuts in a misdirected effort to save the world. And the chapter was entitled something shortcuts. I'll just check it out. A Land Without Shortcuts. It's an absolutely wonderful essay, and it was given in 2010-11 at Magdalen College in Cambridge. So it's well worth a read. And I'll finish by another paragraph from Tim. Again, it's because I'm so interested in his idea of place. And it's such an easy way for us to understand the importance of environment, landscape, archaeology, history, and ultimately all of these things combining geography and cartography and place names to give us a more profound understanding of what we see around us every day. On such occasions, the basic act of attention that creates a place out of a location would be renewed, enhanced by whatever systems of understanding we can muster. From the mathematical to the mythological, by the passion of poetry, or by simple enjoyment of the play of light on it. Here is a gateway to a land without shortcuts, where each place is bathed in the sunlight of our contemplation and all its particularities brought forth, like those mountainside potato plots gilded by midwinter sunset in the valley of the stone alignment.
Okay, thank you very much, Fidelma, for that. And it's a wonderful contribution in terms of your own relationship to Tim and Mairéad, but also, I think, acknowledging the importance and the impact that his work had immediately, but also the legacy of what needs to be recognised and acknowledged into the future. And I think that's something that a whole new generation of scholars, but also I think artists actually have maybe cottoned onto that a bit faster than the Academy has. And I know that your own work as well has, you know, you've been very closely aligned with a lot of artists through Ali Nageltachta and other arts organisations across Ireland, and you've seen how Tim's work has filtered into the arts arena maybe faster than academia in many ways. So I hope that maybe we can maybe bring those two things a little bit closer together here in Galway today as well. So thank you very much for that.
Yes, thank you very much.
Okay. It's my great pleasure now to welcome Moya Cannon to our conversation this morning. Moya Cannon, many of you know already, is one of Ireland's foremost writers and poets. She has 6 published collections, her most recent being Donegal Tarantella. And what I usually do for my students in class, I do an old-fashioned show and tell. So I like to have people's books here on screen. So this is definitely something for your Christmas list. And in her poems in particular, archaeology and geology figure as gateways to an understanding of our relationship with our endangered earth. Music, particularly Irish traditional music, has always been a deep interest and is a constant theme throughout her writings as well. She's received the Brendan Behan Award and the O'Shaughnessy Award, and 2011 was the prestigious Heimbold Professor of Irish Studies at Villanova University in the US. She's edited Poetry Ireland Review and is a member of Éastóna, and we're very much looking forward to her collected poems, which are due out from Carcanet Press in 2021. So Moya, I'll pass it over to you.
Dr Nessa, agus Des, agus Brendan, it's more in pleasure for Iglahan, early, agus it's a great pleasure to be even virtually at the Clifden Arts Week. Tim and Mairéad Robinson used to refer to themselves as T and M, and Tim even used to occasionally sign his books T and M. T and M are gone, and it's hard to believe. It's hard even to talk about them in the past tense. On a shelf in their little sitting room cum library, they had a large wooden cutout of the initials of their names with the ampersand, the and symbol linking them. It was both terribly sad and terribly fitting that they should have died at almost the same time. Tim's Parkinson's disease had suddenly progressed and he'd been hospitalized, so mercifully, he was not even fully aware that Mairéad had died 2 weeks before him. I am quite sure that Tim's extraordinary work would not have been accomplished without Mairéad's devoted support and managerial skills, her questioning intellect, and her rebellious and eccentric spirit. As with their work in support of housing associations in London in their younger years, Folding Landscapes was a joint project. Mairéad had been a manager in Camden Arts Centre and had a degree in law, and it was she who looked after the business side of matters. During their years in Arran, she used to support them financially by returning to London for periods to work with the Housing Association. I owe T and M an enormous debt. Through Tim's maps and writing, I've been introduced, as have so many others, to intimate corners of the landscapes and the sea edges of the Aran Islands, the Burren and Connemara. Anyone opening one of the books or maps cannot but be immediately arrested by the quality of attention manifest there. Robert Macfarlane describes Tim's writing as, quote, one of the most sustained, intensive, and imaginative studies of a landscape that has ever been carried out. Work braced by science, but alive to the imagination's needs and discoveries. On an early visit to the house at the end of Roundstone Pier, I found Tim working on his major cartographical project, the Map of Connemara. He was taking tiny printouts of place names and painstakingly fringing them with a blade. He curved them to follow the swerves of the bays of Connemara, including Clifden Bay, and the mountain ranges of the Mam Turks and the 12 Bens, and he then pasted them onto the large master copy of the map. It is some equivalent practice in relation to language, his painstaking care in the harnessing of words and syntax to faithfully follow reality, which provides so much of the tension and energy of his work. His own rendering of Wittgenstein's words regarding a philosophical proposition in the last Pool of Darkness, the second volume of his Connemara trilogy, that it should be, quote, elucidated by the most subtle and painstaking observation of its behaviour in the stream of life, seems to be a good description of much of Tim Robinson's own precise and stunningly beautiful prose. Who else would think of describing limestone as, quote, a most tender and memorious stone, unquote. My first encounter with the works was with the maps. I came across the map of Arran and was enchanted. I was already well acquainted with Inisheer, the smallest of the Aran Islands. To have every promontory and cove of this small, complex territory lovingly charted and named was a great gift, as was the subsequent Burren map. These were maps brought to a most unusual point of refinement. A musician's house was marked in as well as a megalithic tomb. The maps seemed to operate not only on a plane of space, but also of time, and to throw a trawl net out to retrieve traces of human culture. However, it was not primarily as a cartographer that Tim saw himself. It was one masterpiece, Robert J. Flaherty's film Man of Arran, which drew T and M to visit and then locate themselves in Arran when they were in their late 30s. From that encounter came another Arran masterpiece, Tim's 2-volume Stones of Arran. In Volume 1, Pilgrimage, he writes, quote, I now regard the Arran maps as preliminary storings and sortings of material for another art, the world-hungry art of words, unquote. In its 2 volumes, Pilgrimage and Labyrinth, he views the few square miles of the Arran Islands, a scrap of weathered limestone laid down south of the equator 30 million years ago through the lenses of oceanography, botany, ornithology, geology, history, sociology, folklore, geography, and several other disciplines. The narrator passes from one discipline to another as nimbly as the Arran Islander in Tim's description passes from one tiny field to another via an almost invisible stile in the limestone wall. In spite of the rigour of his research, there's a unique lightness and poetic quality to the work. A year or two after I'd read the first volume, I was in Tim and Mairéad's sitting room when on the shelf behind my chair, I noticed a number of editions of John Ruskin's Stones of Venice. I wondered at my dimness in not having made the connection earlier. The devotion to precision was the same, as was the passion for the genius of a particular water-defined place. I had first met Tim by the Ballynahinch River when visiting another extraordinary man, John Moriarty, whom I'd met a short time previously. They did not know each other well at this point, but over the next 20 years, until John's death from cancer in 2007, a deep friendship developed between them. In their philosophies, they appeared to agree about nothing, Tim being defiantly materialistic, and John, whose knowledge of literature, mythology, philosophy, and religions was as encyclopedic as Tim's in other areas, barely admitting that the material world existed except as a manifestation of spirit. They did share a deep love of the land and sea of Connemara and of our planet, a respect for and dedication to intellectual endeavour, and above all, a profound human decency. Tim and Mairéad were immensely supportive of John in his last years. And of course, they continued to sponsor the annual John Moriarty Lecture at Clifden Arts Week. Tim dedicated his fiction, Orion the Hunter, to John, and it can be read as his own engagement with and ultimate dismissal of a mythological interpretation of reality, a dismissal which ends on a note of regret. I had a battered old Ford Fiesta, and Tim often asked me to bring him here or there for a walk, what I later realised were research trips to various parts of Connemara. In recent years, Mairéad used to say, would you ever take Tim out for a walk, as if he were a housebound terrier? I have memories of his boyish delight in observing the frenzied movements of whirligig beetles in a bog pool in response to our shadows shifting over them, and of his dismay in telling the story of the old man's grave, where during the famine, a man returning over Roundstone Bog from the workhouse in Clifden had died and was buried. And I remember him on his knees on the Maher at Manning Bay, admiring the tiny Maher flowers, fairy flax, tormental, century, trefoil, and on a second visit remarking he was beginning to forget the names of the flowers. I've said I owe T and M a great debt, and I think the country also owes them a great debt. The Polish poet Czesław Miłosz writes in his poem, On Bypassing Rue Descartes, of visiting Paris as an older man and remembering a youthful visit to that capital of world culture. The older man comes to the conclusion, quote, there is no capital of the world, neither here nor anywhere else, and the abolished customs are restored to their small fame. And now I know that the time of human generations is not like the time of the earth. Tim Robinson has restored to many customs and places in his chosen landscapes their small fame. He's done so in collaboration with Irish scholars and with country people who have conserved and honoured the stories of their own places. He has given us the deepest and most resonant of maps. I think of him sometimes in a lineage which includes, amongst others, Robin Flower, George and David Thompson, and Eston Evans. He was one of the great restorers, one of the quiet unravellers of Imperium. Despite the respect for tradition, T&M's vision was conservationist rather than conservative. They were environmental campaigners, And as a friend observed to me recently, their socialism was central to their actions and their view of history. Tim Robinson's writings are reminiscent of the work of Barry Lopez, of John McPhee, of Robert McFarland, and most vividly of Nan Shepherd in her wonderfully poetic and rigorous account of the Cairngorms. However, his background as a mathematician and as a visual artist, in addition to his scientific interests, give his work ever new and unexpected dimensions and perspectives, making it utterly unique. The Aran Islands and Connemara were indeed fortunate to have had such a chronicler. And we were indeed fortunate to have had T and M here for the best part of 50 years. Is kinse jarfa nach me a lehidirís dan, is nach arne vi an tá aithne a chorarfu. Reminder.
Thank you so much, Moya, for your wonderful contribution, and I think just very skillfully interweaving as well with the influences of Tim and Mairéad from their own lives, and also then for us to remind ourselves of how their work has resonance with other writers and other environmentalists across the globe as well. So I'm delighted to welcome one part of the friendship trilogy that we have this morning. We've had some older friends, and now we have a more recent and newer friendship with David Gange, and we're delighted to have David with us from Birmingham as well. David Gange is Senior Lecturer in History at the University of Birmingham, whose works include Dialogues with the Dead, Egyptology and British Culture and Religion, and The Victorians, A Beginner's Guide. Happily though for us, however, his work has taken a more recent turn to look at maritime cultures and histories across the Atlantic. His most recent book, The Frayed Atlantic Edge, which involves kayaking all the Atlantic coastlines of Ireland and the UK, was joint winner of the Highland Book Prize and shortlisted for the Wainwright Prize for Nature Writing. It's a book itself that references the influence of Tim Robinson's philosophical approach to what it means to write about the lives that live between, as what David characterises, the big seas and the small languages on the islands in which we inhabit. So we're delighted to have David with us this morning. And again, as I did with Moya's book, this is David's wonderful book here. I think, Fidelma, you might be very upset. There is a red door in a cottage there, if you can see that.
I'll take that up with you.
I've talked to the copywriters here, but it's a wonderful book, and I know that David also has developed friendships with the Clifden Arts Festival organisers, with Brendan and with Des as well, where he talked about this book in recent times, both in terms of before he had started to write it, but also then afterwards when on his several returns to this part of the world. So David, I'll pass it over to you, and you're very welcome.
Thank you so much, Nessa. So yeah, as Nessa says, I'm here with quite a different perspective from our other speakers, and very, very grateful indeed to have been invited. Because my engagement with T and M was much shorter than that of their long-standing friends, though the impact they've had on me will live as long as I do. So I'd never been to the west of Ireland at all until 2016. And yeah, I'm one of those terrible people who tried to write about place, tried to start writing about place without actually having read the Robinsons' work. And I wasn't even really aware of it at that stage. But I was just beginning to try and write about the sea and landscapes in Scotland. And I'd come up with this eccentric project that involved doing historical research by kayaking all those Atlantic coastlines, with Connemara being somewhere in the middle. So while doing that journey, I got in touch with Moya, having read what is one of my favourite poetry books of all time, her Carrying the Songs, and she pressed on me the need to know Tim Robinson. So after I finished that actual journey, I spent 3 glorious months just immersed in reading about the west of Ireland, and it was totally revelatory. So place writing, I think, that's richer than exists for anywhere else. I hadn't known before that this kind of writing was even possible, especially the writing of Tim that made that place lore into a whole philosophical outlook and way of being. And then, of course, I began to see the influence of the Robinsons everywhere. I found that there were devoted Robinson lovers near where I live in the English Midlands, such as the writer and musician Pippa Marland, who'd been to Roundstone to some of the conversations and to interview Tim and Mairéad a few years earlier. So we met up for coffees in the town of Worcester to talk T and M and Joe Heaney. So equipped with this new reading and a different way of seeing the Irish coastline, I came back and repeated some stretches of the kayak journey. so in Donegal and in Kerry, but the one that proved most significant was here in Connemara. So I spent a second night in just my waterproof sleeping bag on Slinehead, which, like the first, was in driving rain and gales coming in from the west. It was utterly, utterly bleak. So next morning, when I was passing through Roundstone, I was a total mess, just dripping, smelly, horrible. But I had in mind a really beautiful passage in the interview that Pippa Marlin did with him when she was here on her own pilgrimage. And it's one I imagine many might not have seen. I'm not sure if she has published this interview at all yet. But it reveals, I think, the beautifully improvised and kind of intensely human and anti-bureaucratic way in which Tim went about his work. I was going to share the screen, but I think I would just read this quote. So this is Tim answering a question of Pippa's. He says, "Once, a wealthy friend with a big car offered to help me in my explorations of Connemara. Since I wanted to revisit a few remote glens, I accepted and we roared off. Then, 'I must call in at that cottage,' I said, and we squealed to a stop. I knocked at the door, but apart from a twitching curtain, there was no response. Whereas if I'd sweated up the hill, fallen off my old bike at the gate, asked for a bucket of water to mend a puncture, all the lore of the valley would have been forthcoming over tea in the kitchen. But even bicycling is inferior to walking in this context. To appear out of the thickets behind an Arran cottage, or scramble down from the bare moon mountains of the Burren into a farmyard is, I find, a disarming approach, introducing me as obviously unofficial and dying for a cup of tea." So I found that passage really inspirational for all of my own explorations afterwards. And it was having read it and having been in touch with Moya that emboldened me to knock on the door. I'm still dripping terribly of the kind of house in Roundstone Quay. So essentially turning the tables on Tim to see if he was good to his word. And I'm not quite sure what I expected that day, but certainly not the kind of scale of the warmth that I received. I guess I thought maybe I might stick around and chat for an hour or so, but 9 hours later, I was being offered one last plate of food before I hit the water again. So we'd visited Tumbila and a couple of places around Roundstone. We'd talked boats and singers and language, and indeed, all the lore of many valleys had been forthcoming over tea. So since then, I've been to visit them in West Hampstead and communicated in writing, but everything else has just strengthened the impressions of that first day. I loved the introduction to the amazing space that they worked in, the black guillemots bobbing outside the window and the dolphin skull on a shelf nearby. But most of all, I loved the introduction to the dynamic of their relationship. I hadn't known before arriving just how crucial Mairéad had been to everything Tim achieved, how many of the relationships that were central to his work had been built by her, nor just what an intellectual powerhouse or subversive wit she was. So I loved seeing their perfectly complementary but contrasting personalities play out, how the same comment would bring a kind of small, wry, twinkly smile from Tim and a glorious, infectious, big guffaw from Mairéad, which I think sums up a lot of how I experienced their personalities. And I loved getting that sense of perfectly matched collaboration. I don't know of any other life collaboration quite like it, except kind of legendary ones from the past. And it means that they'll always shape not just my intellectual aspirations, but most definitely my life goals too. So I want to finish just by saying a tiny bit about their influence. And I say this very much as someone whose main focus is on places outside Connemara and outside Ireland. And so I write these days mainly on the Scottish coast and islands, and I mix as much with nature writers as historians or geographers, and as much with people in the Scottish Gaelic tradition and the Shetland dialect tradition as any others. And those kinds of writing are currently undergoing a really big boom, reaching bigger audiences than ever before, thanks to people like Robert McFarlane and Kathleen Jamie. And today, in those kinds of circles, there are two names that are spoken with, or kind of in more reverential tones than any others, as inspirations for place writing in the Scottish West. And they are Nan Shepherd and Tim Robinson. And there's a real sense now, in a way that I don't think there was a few years ago, I don't think people were quite aware that writing on place in Ireland really leads the way. As an example of the minority language traditions of the UK, example to follow. And Tim is increasingly recognised by writers in the Western Isles or in the Hebrides as the best point of access to that richest of traditions. And the kind of blend of science and art, past and present, is seen as an ideal model to follow. And this is one way in which Tim is, I think, the perfect antidote to many of the problems of the Academy, dealing equally with time and space, with tragedy and beauty, with, as Moya was conjuring, with kind of mature wisdom and childlike wonder at the same time. So creating this rich sense of rounded understanding rather than kind of siloed specialization. And it's those things that make me think the future of the Robinson legacy is a really bright one, that wherever Gaelic or Irish or Welsh or Shetland are valued, and the ties between place and culture are respected, Tim and Mairéad's names will only grow in stature. So I will stop there. Thanks.
Thank you so much, David. And I actually recall speaking to Tim and Mairéad after you had blown in on them, I think, for that 9-hour epic visit. And they were like, what a wonderful young man. You know, they were just so excited with having you as part of their new circle of friends. And I think that you brought a whole new joie de vivre, but also I think as well, I think for Tim and Mairéad, especially to see how you were doing your own work, both on the water and in the field, I think for them was quite inspiring for them to see a different kind of approach and from a different perspective, but using the kinds of tools that Tim had been kind of putting forth for 40 odd years as well. So I think that the friendship was very much reciprocated from what I heard over cups of tea as well. So it was all great. So at this stage, I'd like to welcome in Des Lally and also Brendan Flynn, who are joining us from the northern reaches of Connemara. And I'd like to invite them to maybe say a few words about their own reminiscences of Tim and Mairéad, and also the importance of Tim and Mairéad being part of the Clifden Arts Festival and Clifden Arts Week as well. So we have Brendan here with us, who has been over, I think, 43 years at the helm at what is Ireland's longest running community arts festival, the Clifden Arts Festival, which was known by Kazu Ishiguro as Ireland's best kept secret. Well, the secret is blown now, so there you go, after 43 years. But Brendan was also honoured by NUI Galway recently with a doctorate for his contribution to the arts and cultural life in Ireland. So we're delighted and very much honoured to have Brendan here with us this morning. So Brendan, I'll pass it over to you in Clifden.
Dis Mairéad Robinson, thanks Nessa for your introduction, and to Moya and to Fidelma and to David. I'll just leave a few thoughts flow like the Owen Glen River below me, but not like the anger of the river when it passed through under the bridge last week. Whenever I hear the bogs of Shanna Heaver, particularly from the Songs of Granite, that beautiful film on the life of Joe Heaney, I think of Tim Robinson, because it was an early morning in February, I think about 1981. We were learning basic photography and Tim was out mapping, and we were, as I said yesterday, fairly high. So Tim just suddenly asked for silence. There were birds overhead that he wanted to hear. And that was my first introduction to what has become an extraordinary friendship with Clifden Arts Festival and the people of Clifden. He and John Moriarty were very, very special in our lives. I remember very well going to White's nursery in Ballinasloe and picking up birch trees and alders and evergreen trees that Tim and Mairéad looked forward to planting, and which John planted beautifully in their garden in Roundstone overlooking the Atlantic. The argument, I suppose, very often in the car, John would have been talking about mythological figures and mystics and whatnot, and by the time we got to Tim, the conversation had changed, even though Mairéad would have had a beautiful meal ready. But John and Tim, as Maya has said, had established an extraordinary friendship of respect for the dignity and for the truth of each other. Tim, as an educationalist, was very interested in all of the young people in the area, and so was Mairéad. I remember years ago, he offered a scholarship and would have continued with it, but I don't know for what reason we didn't follow it up, to any student in the year who wanted to pursue his or her studies. Mairéad particularly was interested in the youth of the area, even though she wouldn't have known them all. She would have inquired as to how they were doing. I think of Tim as a person. I often, in the poetry of Wordsworth, would have recalled Tintern Abbey, but often amid the din of towns and cities, I've ought to her in hours of weariness, sensation sweet. And when you go back over that extraordinary trilogy, particularly the last Pool of Darkness, which covers all of the Connemara landscape, places that our students came from in the 4 buses from an extraordinary wide catchment area. Every place named there, as Fidelma has mentioned, every name has a significance. And it is that total love for the area that Tim has really immortalized. When you talk about Thompson and Flower and Esther Nevins and whatever, there's no doubt but the work of Robinson will stand there with the best. Like it could be like a Van Eyck painting in Ghent, or, Chartres Cathedral, or whatever, the Bach's B minor mass. It will have the same sense of inspiration, of power, of belonging, of maybe hope in these times of pandemic. And as Moya has said, when Derville and I last saw him in London, I was reliving my childhood. Hadn't been to London in 40 years, but we went on the top of an open deck bus up to visit Mairéad and Tim. And Mairéad sat there. She was quiet, but as lively as ever. But her one regret was that Tim wasn't writing. And I said, well, maybe it'll return again. And she said she was afraid. But as we were leaving, he almost said in a form of benediction, give my blessings to Roundstone, give my blessings to the West. And I think of a long time ago now, I remember meeting Kate O'Brien in Madrid, and she had the same longing for Connemara, she had the same longing for Roundstone, she had the same longing for the West. But Tim and Mairéad, that extraordinary friendship on Regatta Day was very, very special. And on the last day of that regatta, Tim walked with me down the stairs. And the regatta was just starting, and Paddy McDonough was in charge of the regatta. And you weren't going to interfere with Paddy because Paddy was in charge, and Paddy himself was at the time terminally ill. And that extraordinary salutation, that respect between the fisherman and the scholar and the academic. He said, I must go over, he said, and shake Paddy McDonough's hand. And Lord save us, you wish in life that you had a camera. And I can still see him Tim bending down into the boat, and Paddy reaching with his big, strong arm, almost pulling Tim into the boat with him. But that extraordinary sense of friendship, of community between place. So the sense of place, as Fidelma has mentioned, is so important. In a way, I'm kind of reading the works of T.S. Eliot at the moment, and place is important in the works of the 4 quartets. But the trilogy of Tim and what he has represented and done for Connemara will live on. And when you talk about his memory, I suppose, have this vision, like for Clifden Arts Festival, it's like when, I suppose, Lady Gregory and Yeats went to Ravenna in 1911, I think, and they saw the marvelous Byzantine kind of more ornaments for the very, very first time. Like in Roundstone over the years, you've had Gerard Dillon, you had James McIntyre, you have George Campbell, you had Maurice McGonigal, you had Kate O'Brien and others. So there's an extraordinary energy, subterranean energy, a Mount Vesuvius of creativity ready there to be exploited and created. And there's enough of creative talent around in a way to see that for the future, maybe a centre like a small Anam Carrig, for all these people who want to come and write and be inspired to study the works of Tim, to study the works of John, to study the works of maybe Gerard Dillon and others. So that would be my wish and vision. And, in a way, and I think of when Newman wrote Poetry of a Gentleman, he had somebody like Tim in mind. Tim, I don't know whether he wrote one for a woman or not, but he would have also had Mairéad in mind, of that sense of decency, of dignity, of love for the spirit. And like Yeats, that love for the imagination. Now, Tim didn't speak that often about the imagination, though I did hear him once mention the importance of Forey's Requiem. So really, really, what a scholar, what a man. And I suppose it's like the municipal gallery revisited, say where man's glory most begins and ends, say our glory was that we had such friends. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Brendan. I think we're really delighted that you were able to give some of your own remembrances of Tim and Mairéad, and I think that image of the hand reaching down across from the land to the sea is something that will last with us all after today as well. Would Des, would you like to say a few words? If you'd like to swing in.
Very good. Hello, Nessa.
Good morning, Des. You're very welcome.
Yeah, thank you. I suppose the early 1980s was when I first encountered Tim, when I used to make the odd little venture from behind the bar in Ballynahinch Castle Hotel, where I was working, outside the front door to get a breath of fresh air. And periodically, over the weeks and over the months, you see the figure of Tim just passing by quietly with his shoulder bag, which contained his notebook on his back. I didn't speak to him. I didn't really know who he was. Later on, both himself and Mairéad came in with little bags of books to ask us would we sell them in the hotel. And they were the first folding landscape books. And I periodically see Tim walking around through Connemara. And in a sense, I knew something was happening. I didn't understand what, but I knew something was happening with the movement of this man around. And as many other speakers have said there, I'd also see John Moriarty walking around, heading off to a garden in Letterdive or Lisnabruca. And it was like, sometimes you see videos of ships passing on the Suez Canal. It's a very dramatic sign. And I often thought that seeing these two figures pass by was like seeing two great ships, two great intellectual, spiritual, scholarly ships pass by, maybe not speaking at all, but you knew something was happening. And I sensed that in the early 80s. Later on, with my involvement with Clifden Arts Festival, again, Tim and Mairéad, T&M, as Moya said, were so supportive and inclusive. And in a way today, and thank you very much for asking me to contribute to this, what I regard as a Zoom regatta, because the passion that both Tim and Mairéad had for inclusivity, for engagement with people, and the welcome they laid out for visiting artists and writers and travellers and wanderers, as David said early on. They were the great bringers together. And when Tim and Mairéad attended an event at the Arts Festival, no matter what event it was, they walked into the room and it was a validation of the arts. And we in Clifden Arts Festival, and we're so happy that this Zoom regatta is taking place today, and will be heard by many people throughout Ireland and throughout the world. That even at this stage, even after T&M are gone, that they are still gathering together people in a spirit of great love, sharing and creativity. As I said early on, I knew something was happening in the early 80s. I could sense it. I could sense this tectonic plate of creativity ready to erupt. Brendan mentioned Vesuvius a moment ago. On one side of the bay, you had John Moriarty. On the other side, near Roundstone, you had Tim. And that tectonic connectivity was ready to erupt into creating marvelous scholarly work, which Tim and John created. I know that going forward, Tim and Mairéad's legacy and dream will carry on. And sometimes when I see T&M written on various works by Tim, where he referred to himself and Mairéad as T&M, I think back to the roaring 60s, the 1960s, and the transcendental meditation movement that some of the viewers may remember. And that, in a sense, T&M speak of that in that T was transcendental. Mairéad inspired meditation in us through Tim, and I think we carry on thinking of them, remembering them in a transcendental way, but also, as Fidelma has said early on, that should be carried on in a scholarly and in an academic forum and gatherings into the future. So it's a great privilege to be involved with this gathering today. As I said, Tim has got us together, and we look to the future with great anticipation, with T and M walking beside us in our memories and in our hearts. Thank you.
Lovely.
Okay, thank you so much, Des. And Des, of course, has been working very closely with Brendan in recent years in the organisation of the Clifden Arts Festival, as a scholar in his own right as well, having completed some doctoral research on the Gate Theatre and a Master's in Irish Studies as well. So we're delighted to have Des with us as well this morning. For the final part of our Zoom regatta, which I'm now going to rechristen everything with that term. Thank you, Des. I'll ask everybody to go on to gallery view so we can see each other. And I'll open just for the final kind of discussions and comments. So Fidelma, I'll round back to you, and then I'll maybe go to Moya and then to David for some final remarks and comments. Was there anything that came up this morning that kind of resonated with you in particular, or any final ideas that you wanted to give to the regatta people here today?
Yeah, I sometimes wonder how Tim felt living in Ireland as an Englishman. It's not anything I ever discussed with him, but I think ultimately he might have seen himself as becoming some bit Irish. And what made me think that is that before he died, as far as I understand it from yourself, Nessa, he desperately wanted to get back to Ireland, which is a very, well, certainly an Irish thing, but it probably exists in many other cultures.
Yeah.
You couldn't die in Ireland. The question was, would your soul pass over Ireland, as a kind of a consolation? And I think he had become quite Irish in many ways. Something I would love to have discussed with him, how he saw himself and Mairéad living as what were perceived, especially with Mairéad, as English, which it wasn't altogether the case. But he didn't get that chance to come back to Ireland, and it's a great loss to us.
Yeah, I think actually one really interesting article or interview that I often direct people to is the interview he did with Brian Dillon, the writer, a number of years ago in the Field Day Review, and it's where Dillon asks Tim that kind of question, how do you see yourself in terms of your own, are you just again another Englishman abroad?
Yeah.
And Tim, I think, was painfully conscious of that, both from our conversations, but both in terms of in his writings as well. And he says in that interview, he gives a very interesting comment where he says that his map making and the place name work that he did was his own act of colonial reparation, and that was the terminology that he used. So I think it harkens back to what Moya had mentioned as well, in terms of that he was an unraveller of the Imperium. And I think that he just felt it was only one small chink of something, but he felt that there was a wrong that had to be righted. The interesting thing though was that he always saw the mapping and the writing and the place name work as a work in progress. It was never to be finished. And that's, I think, the fluidity, that's the artistic eye, that it's never done. that it's and no more than the landscape is ever finished, or that you can draw the terminus around the coastline. Where does the coastline end and finish, as we know, is one of his favorite mathematical conundrums. So I think that idea of process and understanding it, but as David was saying as well, it's about the respect for the place, but primarily I think for the people of the place. And I think a lot of scholars and critics of Tim's writings have overlooked his engagement with the people. And I think that it's primarily that way. It's the people that, that aren't the twitching windows, but open the door, make the cups of tea for people like David and others, and invite them in for the tea and the spuds on the table. And it was actually that kind of draw, I think, that was there for that kind of engagement. That I think if you go back and reread a lot of the writings, that's actually what comes out as being very powerful, is that relationship to the people and the place. And the two, it's like the tuha, the idea of the tuha, they're totally intertwined. And I think Tim got that very, very clearly as well. Moya, I might pass it over to you for some final comments or observations.
Yeah, I mean, it's so stimulating. There's so much just on that particular question. I think that the fact that he recognized the difference between arriving in a big car and arriving with a punctured bicycle was absolutely central. That it was that he was not arriving as you said, Nadine Wishler. So I think it was I think it might have been Christine Cusick in her introduction, that wonderful collection of essays on Tim, Unfolding Landscapes, where she said that central to Robinson's creative process is the very act of asking for stories. It was, he by implication, that it was the people who lived in the place who were the authorities, and so deeply, deeply respectful. And also, I was very interested in what you said, Fidelma, about sentimentality in relation to vernacular culture. One of the words that comes across, of just rereading through several of his books prior to this, the word tenderness. There's not an ounce of nostalgia, not an ounce of sentimentality, but a great tenderness, excuse me, for culture and the people. And it's that just very deep respect, particularly of Robin Flower, and the kind of affection in which he was held is very reminiscent of the affection in which Blahin was held, as Brendan and Des so eloquently put it. The total lack of arrogance. And he said himself, I think, I can't remember exactly where, he said, your ignorance he's talking about the mapping. He says, your ignorance transcends any amount you write about the place or can express on one sheet. So although he was so extremely learned, his lack of hubris, I think, was one of the things that made him truly great. And I have no doubt that his work will grow and grow in stature. I would like to see him respected a little bit more in the context of Irish studies, because I do think, issues of cultural appropriation at the moment have made people very chary, possibly, of giving him the place which he deserves there. But I have no doubt it will come in time. And I suspect that his work resonates very widely and will continue to do so. This kind of fineness does not disappear. We don't get enough of it. It's so obviously precious. And as I was saying, we were so lucky to have known him. Really, it was such a privilege.
I had a little note.
Them both.
Yeah.
No,
Just
absolutely.
you have to keep going, have you?
No, absolutely, Moya. And I think as well, I think that the value of when we have that outsider-insider kind of relationship that happens, and particularly in an Irish context, that how it has been traditionally seen, is often as a kind of a type of resistance that happens in different ways. And also that you have to be of the people or of the place to fully understand it. But I think what people like Tim Robinson and others have done as well, and even if you think of the poet Nuala Ní Dhomhnaill, and in terms of her peregrinations and relationship to Ireland and the language, in different ways, have shown us that you don't have to be of here, from here, 110% to understand the value and the dignity of the people and the place. and that we are an island nation and we need to keep that openness and that welcome, because that's where we've all come from, through one way or the other. So we can all look at our DNA database, you know, and look at ancestry.com. There's nobody 100% Irish out there. So I think that's definitely the value for that, as a reminder to keep that openness and that kind of inclusion that Fidelma talked about as well. Very, very much part of what we should be doing in our new DNA as Irish people in the 21st century. David, I'll ask you for your final comments and thoughts.
Okay, thanks. So yeah, I too was very, very drawn to that phrase that Moya used, the quiet unravelers of Imperium. And I think it speaks to some of the incredible balances that Tim struck. Like, it's incredibly rare to find writing of such political power that is never polemical or sentimental, and managing to strike that balance, and other balances too. For instance, the way that he lets the people and the places that he's writing about speak for themselves, but does so in such an incredible style. So there's such kind of density of language and such a style that is instantly recognizable. And these different balances would seem on paper to be impossible to strike, yet he strikes them. And they're also, I think, part of what makes his writing quite slow burn. The fact that there isn't the polemic there for people to just grab instantly is part of what means that the reputation of this writing will grow and grow as people learn to read it better, as people kind of pick up on the really kind of deep political undertow of it. So yeah, I think that this legacy has an incredibly, incredibly rich future, and one that people will kind of unpick the subtleties of for decades, if not centuries.
Thank you very much, David. I'm going to wrap up now, and I'm just going to just have two little pieces that I'd like to read as well, just by way of thank you to everybody, but also a thank you and a tribute to Tim and Mairéad. This is my final show and tell of the morning. So his most recent volume, Experiment on Reality, and just the final paragraph of his introduction to this essay collection, I think, is one that I have come back to over and over again. Yes.
Nessa,
yes.
Sorry, one thing I forgot to mention was Tim and Mairéad's final gesture was a wonderful, wonderful selection of books that they gave to the library of Clifden Community School. And I will never forget putting the books into the cars, Mairéad standing there, and she was so upset. We all were, because the house was gradually the books had disappeared, and we were taking the final selection. So I just want to state that.
Yeah, thank you, Brendan. And I know that there was something similar was said to us when we were getting the archive into the university as well. It was that the skeleton was left with the house, but the soul was being brought into the Hardeman Library. So I'll leave with final words with Tim, and this is from his introduction to Experiments on Reality. Disembodied life after death is another belief I find aesthetically unattractive. The course of evolution that brought us forth from cosmic dust is a sequence of marvels, the contemplation of which has dazzled and delighted me all my life. And it is demeaned by the spiritualist claim that the soul can exist without the support of matter, as it were by divine conjuring. No, there is only one world, and that is all we need to know. So, Gurmil Mahagirish, osach the Kolodar Madan in Yov, Fan Slán agus Bigi Linaricht. Slán.
Keerdins me tan givrin nishan gal. Wiril keerdins al chashan nawlan. I can fall a rock to menugas karach lobra. Machon hocheshinim is gachin dil glas fast. Skam mishel demo Agnes is van te bo. Ook in de glan dit in de lot met is bo. Huling hel ne liberty de gespart gewoon den glan. Sneeuwgeven ja deze waardin en ja lucht het uit. Skamach nog van ze malagom aan je windje bad. Oro is gevuldig met nieuwe zwila. Wacht ne pipi vader kalkan is ne kajan is je de lan. Vatror ban og leefte la me choru asking klar. Is de biech mochon te diente oer alles gan glad. Mata shall no ein winis bichi dient on the law. Bich mare binis machapin tien roya sepim chan. Sjora padin morgamil shme no segaro vechla. Golen eregin chigal min bratagen segran. Na krille til kalme marnian tamira. Akedigi amil shmesen lotin for me gebra. Bij seiltje dogen niet nieuwe wijn is er man.